Hi, I'm Don DeBar. I'm here with Robert Masterson, who is Associate Editor of Westchester County Weekly, who just came back recently from an assignment in the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine, or Ukraina. He was there for 3 weeks from October 16th to the early part of November with an assignment to look at the after effects of the Chernobyl nuclear accident. Hi, Robert. How are you?
Very good.
Good. I have a couple questions to ask you first. As soon as I find them here. Well, maybe you could give some details on your assignment. We'll start with that.
Okay, well, very generally, what I was asked to do was go over to the Ukraine, tour the country, accompanied by a member of a humanitarian relief organization, and just observe, record the after effects of the nuclear disaster, how it's affected the health, the psychology, the economy of Ukraine.
So what were some of the effects that were, let's say the most obvious effects first?
Well, the country's sick. The country's dying of cancer.
I noticed in the article that you published, that was published in the Westchester County Weekly this past week, the week of the 14th of December, that the population of the country has dropped from 52 million in 1992 to approximately 50 million this 99, I think.
Right. Throughout the entire world, the only 3 countries that report negative population growth are Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And this is a combination of, they say, an interrelation between falling birth rates and lowered life expectancy. For Ukraine, the average adult male life expectancy right now is about 54 years, which is third world rates.
And prior to that,
It was approaching developed world status in the mid to late 60s.
So also in the article, you were touring cancer wards and the children's hospitals, and apparently, or it seems to describe that there are elevated birth defect rates and stillborn children and such. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit?
Well, the problem here, first of all, is I think the lingering effects of the Soviet Union's sort of central bureaucracy. Statistics are, without a doubt, underreported from Ukraine. There's no question in my mind that numbers are manipulated, data is massaged so that the situation doesn't appear to be as bad as it actually is. However, in various parts of the country, talking to doctors and hospital staff, I was told over and over again that the birth rate has dropped by 50%, and amongst that number, birth defects have doubled. Multiple birth defects have doubled. Fatal birth defects have doubled.
So you have a declining life expectancy on the top side, and a larger percentage or grown percentage of the births not being viable.
Exactly. And now I think there is now a 20%, what do they call it? The chances of a child dying in the first 5 years of life are now 20% in that area, which is pretty astounding. 1 out of 5 kids will die before reaching age 5. And something like another 1 out of 5 will die before age 14. So even reaching maturity is very low for those children who actually survive their development and birth.
So, in other words, out of the children that survived the first year, which is where you have your infant mortality rate statistics, another 40% will die by the age 14?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's astounding. In tiny little hospitals, little clinics out in very rural communities, I was seeing wards filled with children with cleft palates, 5 or 6 kids for a town the size of Peekskill. It's astounding. And that was the most visible sign of their birth. And each one of these children carried with them at least 1 or 2 other birth defects. So, you know, the number of miscarriages, spontaneous auto abortions, it just goes on and on and on.
So, wow.
Well, I had an interesting experience with a couple of doctors, for instance. In a town called Zhytomyr, which is west of Kiev, yes, west of Kiev, and southwest of the reactor, the doctor was describing to me how his region's infant mortality rates weren't really that bad comparatively. The numbers were a little low or high, depending on how you want to look at them, but all in all, things were very generally acceptable, considering the situation, considering the economic situation there. And yet, at the same time, he was showing me drawers full of the 3x5 index cards in which they record infant death. And they were full, and they were getting fuller. And so for 1986, we had half a drawer. For 1987, a full drawer. For 1990, 2 drawers. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So on the one hand, he's saying something official, and then on the other hand, he's pointing to the actual number. So we have this sort of balance. And for whatever statistical reasons, for whatever Ministry of Health reasons, certain people were not counted. This child doesn't count somehow as a dead baby. It counts as something else. You know. I went to an autopsy, for instance. This was very instructive. And the child has clearly died from a number of causes, a lot of which related to the pretty high background radiation in that area. As a matter of fact, this was in a small town called Korostan, north of Zhytomyr, west of Chernobyl. And the child had died. They didn't really know why. During the autopsy, we were discussing possibilities here. The doctors were fully convinced that the constant exposure to low-level radiation for both the mother and the developing fetus had lowered resistance, had engendered birth defects. And yet the cause of death ultimately was written on a birth certificate as toxic plasmosis, which is a cross-species infection. People get it from house cats here in the States. So even though here we had a root cause that was fairly clear, that both doctors were confident was the actual cause of death here, it was officially recorded as the bacteria, the parasite, whatever, that's toxic plasmosis.
Like here, sometimes you'll see on people's death certificates, if someone has long-term cancer and say they're treated with chemotherapy or some other therapy and it causes cardiac failure.
Sure. The same thing happened in the United States during the early phases of the AIDS epidemic, in which people who were clearly dying from their susceptibility to infection caused by the virus, their cause of death was being recorded as the opportunistic cancer or infection that had killed them.
An interesting thing in terms of factoring for other things that would bear say on infant mortality statistics, it's striking to note that if you're seeing a doubling by 1990, the Soviet Union didn't collapse until 1991. And so that as a factor on the economic degradation that followed, it doesn't seem as if it would be that much of a factor.
Well, I mean, I think these things are always intertwined. I mean, you can't separate out one thing from another effectively. That's what statisticians do to disguise a situation. Statisticians will say, well, we're only looking at this very narrow range of variables, so we discount everything else. Okay, well, you can do that and very much focus what your results will be. But when you take a look in sort of a holistic way or a gestalt way at the country, what you're seeing is a combination of things. A health crisis, for sure, in large measure caused by this constant exposure to what they call low-level radiation, though the numbers were often very high. Economics in which people are just poor, poverty-stricken, they're cold, they're hungry, they lack proper hygiene, as well as just the endemic sort of depression of this place. This is the sort of classic Eastern European suffering. People sort of absorb this thing or take pride in how much they're able to withstand. And this country's been kicked around for a century.
I'd like to maybe get some description of the places that you visited in terms of the more immediate impacts of the explosion and the damage, the physical plant damage from the explosion of Chernobyl, and then some of the things in terms of the area, the areas that are not inhabited or inhabitable, and relocated populations, things like that.
Well, certainly the most obvious example of the after effect of the accident is a huge swath of the country that's uninhabitable. The area around the reactor is now called the exclusion zone. People are forbidden to be there except through special circumstances, the workers who spend fairly closely monitored periods of time working in Chernobyl station, either as support staff or directly with the power plants. And now, of course, well, let's see, the relocation in which thousands of people were removed from what is now called the exclusion zone. They're scattered all over the country in various parts of Ukraine, and now some of them have actually come back, mostly old people. I spoke with, originally they were considered to be outlaws, and they began moving back within a few years of the accident, unhappy with where they'd been relocated, depressed, whatever. They just wanted to go home. Mostly old people, people in their 60s, people who are now in their 70s, and originally were treated as outlaws, ignored at best by the government. So they were existing without health care at all, without any kind of infrastructure, no electricity, no water, no anything, gas, electricity, whatever. Now the government has recognized these people, mainly because they're not going to be around much longer. But the supposed exclusion zones seem to be fairly open to me. Because of the economics, the exclusion zone now appears very attractive to a lot of people as a resource. It's become probably Europe's largest wildlife refuge. The lack of hunting and trapping and really consistent human habitation has created a situation in which fox, lynx, wolves, I mean, amazing animals that haven't been seen there for years have returned and are thriving. Apparently, whatever genetic damage is being done to them, and there is observed genetic damage to these animals, is more than offset by the lack of human pressure. So they are thriving. There's also feral populations of formerly domestic animals, cows, pigs, horses, cats, and dogs running around. But the people are looking at, in Ukraine, for a number of reasons, what they call forest products have always been a very important part of Ukrainian life, and especially the diet. Things like mushrooms, which have a biological tendency to accumulate radioactivity, berries, wild game, birch switches for their sauna baths and things like that. And now so people are poaching in the exclusion zone for sure. And now as the economic situation gets worse and worse and worse, people are also treating the exclusion zone as sort of as a mine for scrap metal. And more contaminated metal is finding its way into sort of no questions asked, organized crime controlled scrap yards, which are melted down, redistributed throughout Europe. In terms of relocation, you know, there are scattered pockets of people all over the country who originally lived in that area and now have been sent away. And so there are sort of treatment centers and clinics set up for their offspring, mainly, in most major cities.
How large a geographic area is the exclusion zone?
What is it? There are some numbers around. I don't know what they are off the top of my head. It's huge. It's the whole northern, maybe 16th of the country. I'm just thinking visually in a map. Most of the affected area, of course, is in Belarus, which nobody knows anything about because it's this bizarre little Soviet microcosm that is very much clinging to the old models, and it's very difficult to get information out of Belarus. But if we use Ukraine as a model, the entire contaminated area is, oh God, I don't know, size of New York, maybe?
So if you were to draw an analogy, which sitting here in Peekskill tonight seems like a natural, the geographic area with Indian Point as ground zero might be go to Pennsylvania from here, and Hartford and Albany and New York City and beyond?
Right. Oh yeah, clearly. The prevailing winds scattered. I mean, the Soviet Union covered up the accident. If your listeners, viewers, remember the recent sinking of the Kursk, the nuclear submarine, the Russian reaction to that accident was very typical, and you can sort of use that as a model to understand what happened after the Chernobyl disaster, which was first, there was no problem. And then second, sort of, everything's under control and we're doing fine. The third level of reaction is, oh geez, we do have a problem, maybe we need some help. And then the fourth level is we can't do anything about it. We need billions of dollars of foreign aid. So during the first crucial weeks of first crucial days of the accident, when the reactor core was exposed to the atmosphere and just cooking off in the middle of the ruins of the building, they did not notify people. They didn't warn people. There's a lot of bitterness in the country now because, one very symbolic event. The accident occurred in late April. May Day is, of course, a very big communist holiday, and the Soviets basically allowed thousands of children to march in a May Day parade in Kiev while the radioactive cloud was moving into the city. So, yeah, bad problems. All those kids got thyroid cancer, thousands and thousands and thousands of them.
So when we're talking, it was April of 1986, right?
Yeah, the accident was April 26, 1986, and it took at least a week, 10 days for the Soviets to even admit that there had been a problem.
Okay, so perhaps you could describe a little bit some of the interactions that, maybe perhaps first the person that you went with, Olyena Mazyulkivska, who was the in-country director for the Children of Chernobyl Relief Fund, and maybe some of the experiences you guys encountered.
Well, Olyena was sort of my guide, my translator. I don't speak Ukrainian, I don't speak Russian, so I depended upon other people to help me in conversation with everyone, really, though a lot of people do speak English in Ukraine. And she is the in-country director for an international relief organization that was founded very soon after the accident. I think they are in about their 7th or 8th year of operation now, called the Children of Chernobyl Relief Fund. And they've been responsible for placing a lot of really needed medical equipment in children's hospitals throughout the country. I saw dozens of intensive care incubators identified as being part of their efforts. And they ship tons of medical supplies and equipment to the country every year. So Olyena and I traveled from hospital to hospital around the country as she was evaluating the needs and introducing herself. She was new to the job. Introducing herself to the various administrators and doctors that she would be dealing with and is dealing with now, and just sort of making an assessment of the needs of each of these facilities. So we got to travel to, what's on the list here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different cities in those 3 weeks. We spent a lot of time on trains and cars and things like that to visit various hospitals and medical facilities.
I remember I took a train at one time from Moscow to Kiev. Did they have the old boiling water thing for tea, for chai? Yeah.
The big samovar there. Yep.
I remember reading in the article that was published on the 14th, the autopsy that you guys attended, and there were a number of other encounters with people regarding equipment distribution and some of the problems that they had, and some of the, some things that came, if I'm correct, from some Dutch organizations where they had...
We don't know. Before we even imply that we know who's responsible for this stuff. It's a fairly common practice. It's something that I've heard about a long time. When was the Turkish earthquake, the big, huge Turkish earthquake? 5, 6 years ago? Maybe longer. But I remember reading then that humanitarian relief organizations were being manipulated or participating or complicit or unknowingly, who knows really, helping pharmaceutical companies clear out their dead inventory. So I remember reading when the Turkish earthquake hit that one shipment had contained boxes and boxes and boxes of out-of-date hemorrhoid cream as emergency relief aid. Nice example. However, touring the country here in Ukraine, what we did notice in several different places, and Olyena was as appalled about this as I was, that bundled with various kinds of relief aid, blankets even, or in one case, some hospital beds that had been manufactured in Holland. Along with these vital necessities, along with these things that the hospitals and the doctors and the nurses desperately needed to perform their tasks, were also bundled basically garbage. Very expensive cancer drugs that had expired. So obviously someone is making some money here, either by declaring these in their home country's taxes as a charitable donation, or being able to move inventory out. And I really, can't really say too much beyond what I directly observed as to who's responsible or how this is coming about. It's an investigation that we are doing, and we hope to be able to say something in the paper more concrete about that next year, after the first of the year. And we are tracing, I was able to snag some samples, for instance, and I'm tracing them now through batch and lot numbers to figure out the life story of this particular cancer drug and how it ended up in a garbage pile in Ukraine. But we also found things like rusted and broken surgical instruments, those catheter trays with the sterile seals punctured and broken, glassware that had been broken, blood pressure cuffs from the 1960s probably, each with a fairly substantial amount of mercury in them, bundles of what looked to be dirty linen and dirty bandages from a hospital in England. At least the laundry bag had a mark on it from a hospital in Britain. So somehow or another, this is, well, Ukraine was best described, the former Soviet Union countries, I think, were best described recently as kleptocracies. That is, they're run by thieves, and I think that's very true. The level of corruption there is astounding. I've never really seen anything like it. It makes Yonkers look very above board, I'm happy to say.
You had to travel some to find that, huh?
Yes, you never know. There's no place like home, I guess. But so somewhere along the line, a lot of garbage is being dumped into this country, as I'm sure it is in other countries that receive humanitarian aid. And somewhere someone's making money off these people's suffering. I was talking to the doctor in Dnipropetrovsk, whose #3 Children's Hospital sits empty now. Newly constructed building, very nice, very modern, but he has nothing to supply it with. And he showed us the place where they store the garbage that they receive in humanitarian aid shipments. And he's very afraid that some of the material will make its way into the black market, which thrives. He can't really dispose of it properly because it's toxic medical waste, harsh, very dangerous chemicals, mercury, heavy, the whole deal. So it's sort of a bad situation. Anyway, there's a special hell for these people in which they will get very, very sick and go to a hospital that they supply.
One of the things that people lose sight of when they think about, even when they plan for a disaster like a nuclear power plant explosion, is that it doesn't take place in isolation, but within a larger context. If you have difficulties or stresses in a medical system, for example, suddenly making everyone in the vicinity a patient, the entire thing can collapse around it, and there are economic and other consequences that in turn just cascade after a while and can reduce the situation to a much worse state than just the nuclear explosion.
Well, clearly that was happening in Ukraine, and I know the New York Times, and I've been following it, you probably have, has been running a long series of articles about the state of Russian healthcare and what around the Moscow area and things like that. But clearly what's happened is that what had once been a centrally planned medical system has now been fragmented into almost autonomous units that are functioning on their own. And because of communism, I think, and a lifetime of Soviet training, many of these administrators and the doctors involved don't really know how to gather funds, don't know how to raise funds, don't know how to present their case. They expect the state to step in. Well, the state's stealing the money and is not giving it out. So they're on their own, and they try to do fundraising efforts and solicit grants and donations, primarily from the foreign community, as best they can. But so you'll see one hospital with a dynamic, new capitalist or more modern mindset in its administration, who can equip themselves, who can manage and administer their hospital. And then at another place, you'll see the administrators don't have the experience, the skill, the talent, or even the information they need, and the hospital will have absolutely nothing. And I saw hospitals that had nothing. The main medical supply they used was bleach as a disinfectant.
So, and along those same lines, and it's interesting that you had mentioned Yonkers before. In the event that there were a disaster here, which is one of the things I think is of interest to people about, aside from what happened in Chernobyl by itself, that the possible relevance to their own lives. The differences between the healthcare systems in the Soviet Union or the old Soviet countries and in the United States there in several areas, although the technological development in the United States of healthcare is much higher. Formerly, the distribution of healthcare in the Soviet Union was much more even prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It wasn't great healthcare by Western standards, but at least it was available on a consistent basis.
And one of the criticisms and one of the problems that people experience themselves here is that health care is not always available to them. And my question is, in the event that there were a disaster here and there were a strain on the medical services and rationing, essentially, of the medical services, does the model that's employed now give any clues about how that health care is going to be delivered to the people who are the victims of a disaster? And also, if you think about how it's going to be administered, it'll be administered in places like Yonkers and Peekskill by the government officials and others.
Well, let me back up to answer that, because if there was a disaster, despite the obvious benefit that such a disaster would have, for instance, by like wiping out Yonkers. No, I'm sorry, I had to. No, I really want to make it clear, though, that they're not really equivalent situations. The Soviet reactors are not shielded and contained in the same kinds of ways. And here I think is where some of the problem in Western perception, or at least in the United States, comes into play here. Soviet reactors were built in buildings that looked like a supermarket and had about the same load-bearing capacity. So when the Chernobyl reactor blew up, and it blew apart a building that was essentially cinder blocks and sheet metal and exposed its core to the atmosphere. That really couldn't happen here. The danger, however, from a reactor in the United States is the cumulative effect, what we see worldwide, and what Ukraine and those parts of the former Soviet Union now are functioning as a laboratory to study, is the long-term exposure to low levels of radiation, lifetime exposure to low levels of radiation. Now, the scientists will say, here are the levels, you get more radiation from a chest X-ray, right? Or you get more radiation from flying, in an airplane at 30,000 feet, which is absolutely true, except you don't live in a chest X-ray. You don't live in an airplane at 45,000 feet. So now that we're seeing the second generation of people who are maybe not directly affected by the explosion and that burst of really lethal toxicity that was concentrated in that area, we're seeing millions of people who are affected from living, growing up, and spending their entire lives in what they're calling low-level radiation areas. And it's a debilitating effect. So certainly the Soviet Union's medical system and the Ukraine's medical system is in no way, shape, or form prepared to handle the emergency status that the Chernobyl accident represents. There's this immediate and crushing need for an increasing number of people for medical treatment, for the thyroid cancers, the soft tissue cancers, the leukemias, the bone cancers, the brain tumors, and the multiple birth defects and the genetic damage that that country is seeing. What we will see in this country, if nuclear power continues to be used and if the reactors continue to leak, which they will, and they do, and they are, is a general increase gradually of that background level of radiation. And those are insidious health effects. So I sincerely, in my opinion, I doubt if we'll ever see the point where Westchester County is evacuated and eventually becomes a wildlife preserve because no one's allowed to live there. But what we will probably see over the years is what I've seen in my life growing up in a nuclear community, that these populations are more susceptible to such things as birth defects and these sort of esoteric cancers. And how the health community responds to that, remains to be seen. How are they handling the AIDS epidemic right now in the United States?
Okay, so if you had any advice for viewers with the benefit of your experience now, what would it be?
Get a sense of humor, because advice for viewers about the relationship with nuclear power. I don't really know what to say about that, except
About anything, actually. Maybe it's just don't go to Ukraine for a while.
yeah, maybe go. There's a lot of bargains to be had there. Things are cheap. The country's collapsing. President's about to. Well, the president is himself, Kuchma, is deeply implicated in the kidnapping and murder of a journalist, which has sort of been overshadowed by the Chernobyl shutdown. Chernobyl, if I had to take a bet right now, they're going to start that reactor back up. It supplies something like, well, estimates vary between 3 and 14%. I'd say maybe 9% of the country's entire energy needs are supplied by that single reactor. They have made absolutely no contingency plans to replace that energy or to deal with the workers, the thousands of workers in an already economically stressed country who are now immediately out of work. So, talking to the director of public relations there one afternoon, they still have a refueling scheduled for January, and they haven't canceled it. And number 3 is actually fine. Number 4 was the bad one, problems. Number 2 shut down after accidents. Number 1 shut down after accidents. Number 3 was shut down on the 27th of November after essentially what happened in Ukraine was a big ice storm came and the power grid collapsed. And 3 reactors, because of the sudden drop in demand, blew up their transformers and went on to safety, shut down, and things like that. So Chernobyl number 3 was actually operating only at about 1% capacity on Friday when they shut it down because they wanted something to push they wanted to push a button and say it's been shut down now. But it's still functioning, and it could very easily be started up. And the country's in desperate need. They're planning on building reactors to replace it, only by Western standards rather than Soviet standards. I don't know. I was raised by physicists. I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and nuclear power has a lot of potential. It's just, I don't think you need to put it in the hands of the lowest bidder and capitalists. Maybe we need a little more research and development here before we start throwing electricity online. The promise was always of electricity too cheap to meter, essentially free electricity for the world. Obviously, that's not occurred. So I think, well, if I was going to give people advice, I'd say look at the history. Chernobyl is the worst case scenario for a nuclear reactor. It truly is. That country is dying, and I personally don't have much hope for it. What can you do? There's the best thing probably to do for Ukraine would be to scrape the top foot off the entire country and shoot it into space. It's contaminated soil, and it will remain so forever. But to a lesser degree, these things are happening now. We had our own 3 Mile Island here. We have hundreds, dozens, who really knows how many nuclear submarines and military vehicles, ships, aircraft carriers chugging around the world. Indian Point leaks periodically. It's got out-of-date equipment. So we need to really evaluate our own energy needs versus the cost of that energy.
I'd like to thank you for your time, and thanks for informing. By the way, there's going to be a few more installments from your trip.
There will be 2 more articles on the 21st and the 28th.
That'll be in the Westchester County Weekly, so look for it. Thanks a lot, Robert.
Thank you.
As you know, yesterday, I had called for the shutdown of the Indian Point plant based on the fact that there was a reported leak somewhere in the reactor system. And that one of my major concerns was the fact that there was a tremendous lack of communication between Con Edison, county government, and the rest of the governments in Westchester County and the NRC. I told you at that point that I had contacted, I'd made calls to the President's office, to Senator Clinton and Senator Schumer. And we had sent a letter to the NRC. And Senator Schumer got right back to me as soon as he got out of some event that they were having yesterday.
First day as senior senator.
It was his first call, he said.
It's true.
Before I put him at the microphone, I should let you know that I got a call from Eugene McGrath, who is the CEO and chairman of the board of Con Edison. He came in this morning with a number of his staff He explained their point of view and what they thought was happening at Indian Point. Subsequent to that, I got a call from Hub Miller, who was the regional director of the NRC. He explained his point of view and what they thought was happening at the plant. I listened. I told them I appreciated their call. We had a long discussion of communication and lack of it. We talked about getting together later on in the very, very near future. Now, that's the situation as of now here. The senator has some thoughts on this, and I'd like to bring him up to the microphone.
Thank you. First, let me thank the great county executive, and I know it's always said by one politician to another, the great county executive, but this guy is a great county executive and has done a fabulous job. And I don't think it's not a coincidence I'm here, because he's always, whenever there's a problem with the federal government and Westchester County, he is on the phone and fighting for the citizens there. So I believe every citizen of this county is lucky to have you, Andy. Look, I'm going to talk a lot about this, or some of the things I'm asking be done that I've worked out with the county executive, but I would say that all of this can be summed up in one sentence to paraphrase the movie Cool Hand Luke. We have here a failure to communicate. And that's been the basic problem. For the last year, the residents near the Indian Point nuclear power plant have been living next to what increasingly appears to them to be an accident waiting to happen. From fears about the quality of the equipment to concerns about the way the plant is run, the residents of the surrounding communities have been justifiably nervous that Indian Point poses a major risk to them and their families. And these anxieties have only been heightened by the latest incidents this week, as Con Ed got ready to resume operation of the plant, only to find yet a report of another radioactive leak. Now, I know that people from Con Ed and NRC will say, well, these are just normal leaks. But given the past, given the fact that there was a 1997 report that it was not followed up on properly, that then there was a serious leak, you put all that together, and it's totally befuddling to me that neither the NRC nor Con Ed communicates to the residents of the community, the county executive, and the other officials before they do anything. Because we are not dealing with a little steam generator here. We're dealing with a major nuclear facility. And even if every safety precaution is taken, if people don't know it, and particularly since there had been a major mistake before, they're going to expect the worst. And so you have fear that's rampant here, and it seems to me that the NRC and Con Ed are not doing their duty to tampen down that fear by letting people know ahead of time what they plan to do and letting there be comment on it. So, after close to a year of promises and efforts to ensure safety at Indian Point, the plant has continued to be plagued with problems, and I today am calling on the NRC to do two things in light of this latest incident. First, I'm asking the NRC to pause the current resumption of service at the plant until it reviews and inspects the major safety components and equipment and guarantees that it's safe to operate. Second, I am asking the NRC to develop a series of protocols specifically designed to ensure that Indian Point 2 is properly overseen, and that the community's concerns are addressed, and that everyone is properly informed in a timely way of what is going on in the plant. These protocols should include a series of inspections to be done by an independent review panel, which will be comprised of not just industry experts, but also of local officials. They should include mandatory public briefings that are regularly scheduled and well publicized. To that end, I'm also calling on the NRC today to send representatives to the area, which I believe they have done, as soon as possible, not only to explore the plant, that they've done, but to brief the community on what went on this week. Con Ed was right to replace the steam generators that failed at Indian Point last February, but it and the NRC need to do a lot more than just issue written statements to reassure a nervous public. Until the NRC verifies that Indian Point's in good working condition and will not leak, the doors of this nuclear power plant cannot, in good conscience, be reopened. Hopefully it'll take a short time. Hopefully they will find nothing wrong. But until that point, I don't think the plant should be running. When it comes to the operation of a nuclear plant with a history of leaks and shutdowns, the public's concerns must not just be pacified, they must be put to rest. And the best way to put things to rest is, frankly, an open form of communication. I wish I didn't have to call for a series of protocols. I wish we could just say, communicate. But unfortunately, the history of the past communication hasn't been very good, and I think only with protocols like this can we be assured that people will, that the plant will be safe, and people will be informed of exactly what is going on.
Question. Senator Schumer, how are these protocols different from the protocols that already are specific to that?
Okay, they would be in greater detail. They would specify in a much more careful way about when information had to be let out. He would not have been informed under our protocols by a call from a newspaper reporter that the plant had started running again. In other words, it would be much more step by step than sort of general admonition. Yes.
Senator, this pause, are you talking about shutting it back down so that people can go in and check everything, or are you talking about keeping it at the level it's at now on its way up?
No, I am talking about shutting it down until, and I think it will be quick, but until there can be a thorough inspection and a report can be issued to the community. Because, you know, you're dealing with all sorts of things here. You're dealing with fear, you're dealing with property values, you're dealing with all sorts of dragons and demons, some real, some imagined. But in a normal nuclear plant, maybe you wouldn't go this far. But since there's been the big mistake, and the NRC by its own admission, and Con Ed by its own admission, didn't handle things properly once, there has to be extra effort to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
I'd like to ask Mr. Spano a question, if I may. Can you describe the tone of your conversations today with Con Edison and also with the NRC? I believe you said you spoke with them as well. Are you satisfied
My concerns were forceful. The tone of the conversation was amicable, as it usually is, although they certainly got my message. I listened to them. I have not made any kind of predetermined decision on whether I believe what they're saying or not. But I'm open to discussions. I told them I would prefer this plant be down, just as the senator has indicated, so that everyone can feel very comfortable with it.
Were you satisfied, though, with this conversation you had with them today?
I was satisfied with the conversation. I was not satisfied with the information in the conversation.
The information they gave you, was that their explanation of exactly what went wrong in the plant?
That's correct.
It should have happened by our protocols before the plant was turned on, before news of this leaked out.
See, the problem here is that no matter how minimally they can express the issue at the plant, we have these concerns based on our previous history with them. Given the lack of communication in the entire process, it's exacerbated the whole situation.
They seem to have the feeling at Con Ed that if it's what they consider to be a minor problem, and that they can correct, so they don't need to tell you unless it's out of control. Is that, otherwise, you'd be overwhelmed with calls every day about some little problem here, some little problem there. What's your own view on that? Would you rather know everything that's going on?
My view on that is the same thing,
Or if
the
you're
same
having a
answer I
problem,
would give you if you asked me that question about the county government. Okay? If I have a minor incident here that I think the public would get exacerbated about, but it's only minor, I shouldn't tell you?
And one other point, Ms. Witherspoon, which is this. If we hadn't had a bad history here, maybe you'd say this is going too far. But we've had a terrible history, so there's total mistrust. And part of the job of Andy and myself as elected officials, the main job obviously is to make sure the plant is as safe as possible. And of course we need electricity. We need it more than ever before. But a second and important job is to make sure that people feel comfortable in their lives, that they're not keeping their children inside, that they're not, boiling the water, that they're not afraid to sell their home or buy a home. I mean, it goes way beyond just the issue, and because, again, we've had a bad incident once, extra steps ought to be taken.
Senator, the NRC is often criticized being too close to the nuclear power industry. Do you think we need to have a whole review of the way the NRC functions and to have more of an accountability to the public and less to the industry?
Well, I don't think it has to be a dichotomy here. There certainly has to be more accountability to the public when you're dealing with issues like nuclear power. Even those who would be far stronger advocates of nuclear power than I, and I am not one of these people who's against all nuclear power, but stronger advocates than I would be served by the fact of having full and fair information out there. And I would say this, the old way of thinking at the NRC is keep everything quiet. And that just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work in modern America, and it certainly doesn't work near a plant where keeping quiet has led to real problems.
Mr. Spano?
Let's take someone.
Yes, Senator Schumer, who will oversee the NRC's inspection and conclusions?
Well, as I said, one of the things we've called for is a panel not only of NRC people, but of local officials, et cetera, so they would be involved in this. But then it's all of our jobs as elected officials to take the information, either digest it ourselves or go to independent experts. We also call for them here, so that we would have some outside independent judgment. Judge Brandeis said sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. If the information all comes out, generally you can figure out what's going on and what to do about it.
Yeah, I was wondering, when you met, or we spoke with the officials this morning, said you didn't get the information, you weren't satisfied with the information. Could you tell me what information you sought specifically and did not get the answers?
No, they gave me information on what they thought the problem was, and I listened to it. They presented diagrams, they told us how the plant worked, how this was very safe. I listened to it, but I'm not so sure that that's correct and that it's not safe. I have to discuss that with other people, so I listened very carefully. I wasn't sure that the information was correct, that's all.
What did you tell them?
I told them just what I just told you.
Did they give you any assurance that they would inform you about these things in the future?
We talked long and hard about a process that accomplished that. We didn't get into any specifics of the process because I hadn't talked to the NRC at that point, hadn't talked to Senator Schumer, have to talk to a number of other people, but we talked about a process. They understood, both the NRC and Con Edison understood the discrepancy in communication in this whole process.
And I'm hopeful that the letter that we have sent to the NRC and a copy to Con Edison, that they will accept our recommendations. I don't think this one has to be one of these fighting loggerhead issues. This is going to be good for everybody. But rather than leave it to chance or to accident, there ought to be a set pattern so he knows what to expect, so the community knows what to expect, and those rules ought to just be followed.
Senator, what if they're rebuffed on these requests?
I can't imagine they'd rebuff us. If they do, we're going to try to do we could try to get some kind of legislation passed. We could look at regulations. We could go higher. But I am hopeful that they won't rebuff us. I'm optimistic.
Well, Senator, to be specific to this, it's one thing for them to not refer to you on the communications aspect, but you're asking them to shut down this plant that they think, can be safely operating even with an ongoing leak. Do you really think that they'll do that?
Well, because it would be a very short period of time, and because the community hasn't gotten notice and hasn't received assurances, I think it would, in the long run, behoove them to do it. If they don't, again, we can see where we go from there. But when I was talking about my optimism, I was talking about the protocols that we're issuing, which could avoid this problem in the future. I don't know what their they make $600,000 a day when this plant is going, Con Ed does. And isn't that right?
That's a whole other issue.
Right.
They are passing on that $600,000 a day right now.
To the other ratepayers.
To the ratepayers. The ratepayers get that money back when the plant is operating. And how do we prove they're getting it back?
Right. But that's a different issue than this one. So you want to be careful about it. But I think because they made the mistake, this again will be very short term, and it would be in their interest to do it. And I just await their response. I'm not going to throw down a gauntlet on that issue.
Someone back there?
Senator, how soon do you expect a response from Congress?
Soon, very soon.
Meaning tomorrow or?
I hope so, tomorrow or the next day. Now, they may say on the protocol part, let us sit down with you, maybe there's this one that ought to be changed this way or that way, and we're certainly open to talk about that.
Senator, I was a little unclear about your remarks having to do with the new standards or protocol that you would like to see set at Indian Point 2. Could you just go over that one more time? What would you like to see at Indian Point 2 that is?
Okay, well, I'm going to be very clear here, and just read it so you will know exactly what we are asking. We're asking them, in terms of the protocols, to develop a series of protocols specifically designed for ensuring that Indian Point 2 is properly overseen, that the community's concerns are addressed, and that everyone is properly informed. And the last is really important. There's lots of details that we're asking them on that. They will include the protocols, a series of inspections done on a regular basis, not just when a problem arises, with independent experts and local officials, not just industry officials. And we think that will benefit everybody. They will also include mandatory briefings. In other words, my view is, given what's happened, once a month, once every 2 months, even in normal time, they ought to report back to people as to what's going on at the plant, what problems might be occurring in the future, etc. And that would avoid, well, that's really it. We're also calling for the NRC to send representatives here as soon as possible, not only to look at the plant, which they're doing now, but also to brief the community. But if the protocols came in, that would happen regularly, not just on this ad hoc basis. Okay?
Mr. Spano, yesterday you said that you didn't trust Con Ed, you no longer trusted the NRC, you couldn't believe what they were saying, and you thought the incident was more serious than what they were telling you. Is that still the case, having spoken to them? Do you think
I
it's more
don't think I
serious?
said the last part. I said, I thought that the incident could be more serious than they were telling us. That what I had read in the newspapers and what I had heard of the incident was that there was a radioactive leak in the nuclear section of the plant, that they didn't know where it was coming from, that they didn't know how to stop it, and that they were going to take care of it maybe 18 to 24 months from now when the plant shut down. That's what concerned me, and that's what I could not believe.
My question is, having spoken to them today, has that doubt been assuaged?
No, it has not.
Have they made any promises that you'll no longer be finding out about these incidents from members of the press?
Yes, they have. Well, You guys have other ways of finding things out. They said they would not be notifying the press before they would notify us. Okay.
I mean, thanks, everybody.
Yes, since the NRC issued the red citation on November 20th,
Right.
are you aware what changes have occurred at the plant? I haven't seen anything in the public.
Well, again, this is the kind of thing we want to know, and that's the whole purpose of my letter to the chairman
Thank
of the
you.
NRC. We don't know. It did get a red flag designation. Again, the more specific and more public all of this is, the better off everyone will be.
Will members of the public be included on your
Yes.
panel?
Yes. Okay, thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody, and good.